All right, so hello everyone and welcome to this UN Behavioral Science Week 2024 session on gender and behavioral science. For those of you who haven't seen me, my name is Mary McLennan. I am the Senior Advisor on Behavioral Science to the Executive Office of the Secretary General. I also lead the UN Behavioral Science Group, and I will be moderating today's session. So before we get into the content, I just wanted to speak very briefly about UN Behavioral Science Week. So if you're here, there's a good chance you've probably seen the agenda, but just to say that there are 38 entities participating this week. So it's the biggest and most diverse behavioral science week you've had yet. This is 6 years of us hosting Behavioral Science Week. The agenda is here. We'll put it in the chat for you shortly. But there's still sessions to come later today, as well as on Thursday and Friday, and topics like sustainability, as well as health, peace and security. So some big areas of work for the UN as well to come. So I encourage you to check out the rest of the agenda. And we also have recordings on our YouTube playlist if you'd like to see what's already taken place and catch up on some of the sessions that have already happened. All right, okay, so in terms of some housekeeping regarding today's session, we ask that you very much have questions and put them to our speakers and our panelists today. We ask that you put them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, not the chat, because we won't be taking questions from there. So put them in the Q&A box, and you'll also have the opportunity to upvote the questions of your colleagues in the Q&A box. So even if you don't have one yourself, check out the box and like the ones that you would like to hear our panelists and speakers debate and talk about. Okay, so now on to our speakers for today. So we're very fortunate to have with us a diverse panel from across the UN exploring wide areas of behavioral science application in the domain of gender. So first we'll hear from Ana Maria Munez-Bude from the World Bank, who's probably well known by many colleagues applying behavioral science in the UN. She's been a member of the community for a number of years. We also have Anna Grivala from the UNDP, who's working on an interesting project within UNDP. And Magdalena Howland from UNODC, and then finally Dana from the World Bank, who'll be joining us in the Q&A and discussing some of the bigger issues that come up in today's discussion. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing and turn it over to Ana Maria. Over to you.
Thank you, Mary, and hi everyone. Great to be here. So multitasking is not my forte this morning for some reason. I hope everybody can see the slides. Can someone say yes?
Yes, we can see them.
Great, thank you. So, so great to be here. I'm always looking forward to UN Behavioral Science Week. There's a lot to learn here. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some work that we've been doing in light of the new gender strategy of the World Bank, but also work that the Mind, Behavior and Development team embed at the World Bank has been engaged for quite a while now, which is to address social and gender norms to promote gender equality. We've recently put together a summary policy note on evidence on both measurement and interventions, both behavioral and not, for gender norms in particular. And we have a very large work program on measuring and addressing social norms around gender, both in education, female labor force participation, childcare, and others, covering regions from South Asia, so Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, the Middle East and North Africa, Morocco, Tunisia, Jordan, and Lebanon, Iraq also, and I'm probably missing one country, and Indonesia, and more. And our colleagues from the Africa Gender Innovation Lab have also a very large program in Sub-Saharan Africa on addressing norms in different domains. What I'm going to present to you today is a little bit of the summary main messages from the policy note that we put together that summarizes both the evidence in terms of measurement as well as interventions. So just to start, I don't think anybody needs a refresher, but one of the things that we've been pushing for is to work with a clearer and more concise definition of social norms that allows us to then get into better interventions. So social norms are prescriptive, an unwritten, often informal or implicit rule for behavior that is common knowledge. It's basically accepted by a social group. And this means that it is context dependent. So our social norms in the office are very different than our social norms at home and or in our community. In many cases, they overlap, but not always. They're externally derived. They're not our idea of what it is to be a good person, but they're more about our society's idea of what it is to be a good husband or a good wife. They arise from social interdependence. So they keep order. So they have a positive role. However, in many cases, as we see for gender, there's some harmful norms that are not necessarily there to maintain any order, but to support power relations. And they're held in place collectively or by influential people, which we call a reference group, those that we think are going to scrutinize us, are going to have a comment, are going to criticize, or may even sanction us, or who are with us. And they have a perceived social reward or a sanction to non-compliance. Gender norms are a subset of these norms and operate in the same way, but specifically in the relation to women's or men's behaviors. And gender roles are a subset of gender norms that operate on what are prescribed feminine and male activities and roles to be had in a society. So we've been working on better measurement. For the most part, up until now, social norms are measured by proxy measures, which is outcomes. Do girls go to school? Attitudes, who think what about what? Laws, do the laws allow for divorce? Do the laws allow for women to open a business? And policies. So how are policies designed? So taxes, are taxes designed to be household and family taxes? Are the taxes individual and others? The most common way are this type of agreement with statements such as being a housewife is just as fulfilling as working for pay, which tends to come from surveys such as the World Value Survey, the Gallup World Poll, or others. We've been working on more direct measures of social norms that try to go to the social expectations. And this includes some pilots that the World Value Survey has been doing. So say, for example, asking people, how many women in your community do you think work outside the home? Not only do you work outside the home, have you ever done this? What will happen if you work outside the home? If a woman does work outside the home, she may be criticized, she may have arguments with her husband, she may have arguments with her in-laws, she may be considered immoral. So as you see here, in Ethiopia, for example, about 2/3 of women think that other women work outside the home. Less than half actually do it. And there are many different variations in the fear of criticism, mostly around domestic arguments or arguments with the in-laws. So this tells us a little bit more than just, do you agree, in terms of what are the policy entry points. Because it unpacks the norm in these four main components, which are the behaviors, what people do, the attitudes, which is what do people believe they should do, what is known the descriptive norm or the social empirical expectation, depending on the literature that you go on, which is what do people see others do or assume others do. And the trickiest and probably the most normative part of them all, which is the injunctive norm or the normative expectation, which is what do I think others want me to do? So if you take this to say education, girls go to school, people think that girls should go to school, most households send their daughters to school, and people would agree if I send my daughter to school. So when we measure all of this together, we can find phenomena such as the one was called pluralistic ignorance, which is when there is a difference between personal beliefs and what we think others believe, which is a very important insight for policy. And here you have an example from a survey that the World Bank did together with Meta during the pandemic on gender equality at home. And this was asked, people were asked, do you think men and women should have equal opportunities? And how many people in your community out of 10 you think will agree with women should have equal opportunities? And what you see here across all world regions is that the personal beliefs, which are the darker dots, are more progressive than what people think their communities and their societies think, which are a little bit less progressive. So this difference is what we call pluralistic ignorance. If you think about the question about women's more important role is to take care of the home, then what we find is that in regions such as South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, there is no difference. So there is a very strong alignment, which tells us that the norms are real strong on this point. We've prepared or designed a stylized form to think of where you go if you want to do an intervention for social norms adoption, by thinking in terms of the strength of the norm. So how many we see behaving in a specific way and the percentage of people that agree with this. So the phase one is where basically there's very limited acceptance. Nobody's breaking the rules. Everybody's behaving as this is the natural state. Going with a communications intervention here will make no difference whatsoever. Changing the legislation might probably make the legislation completely ineffective if it's not enforced really strongly, because the transition costs are too high and there are power dynamics, and many of these behaviors are considered identitarian. I'm going to talk about policies later. The gray line is where we find this pluralistic ignorance that can be corrected, and we can also create, we're seeing more people breaking with the norm, and then this can be enforced. And then on the top, where just basically everybody now has adopted a new norm, there are always going to be pockets of resistance, which are the ones that give us the risk of backlash, particularly if these are loud, powerful minorities. So let me go to the policies. So what we are proposing for the World Bank, and I think for all of us, is to stop thinking about norms neutral interventions, because there's not such a thing as the norm neutral interventions, but to go from norms aware policy designs, which consider the norms that are at play, ask themselves, is there a norm and which norm is here, to norm sensitive ones, which consider the conformity traps, the structural and environmental factors that can reinforce the norm. Think of this as Jenga tower, right? I don't know if you play Jenga, but if you remove some of the bricks, then you can start diminishing the strength of the norm, and to norm transformative that seek to fundamentally change what supports an unequal norm. And I'll give you a few examples of the different channels. So we have indirect influence. So these are channels that we're going to use that are sufficient, but not are necessary, but not sufficient. And if this is a norm blind policy, it will reinforce the norm. And these are the usual policy areas: laws, services, resources, and market interventions. So take, for example, in Malawi, a cash transfer and payment of school fees, conditional on girls going to school, reduces early marriage and pregnancy. This is sort of like a standard example of a strong incentive, financial and systemic, that can actually make a change in terms of the norm about going to school. Or in Bangladesh, where the ready-made garment sector expanded, changed the incentives for women to start working, and as a reflection, changed the norms around what women can do, women being around on themselves in the city, women working, and others. If we think of more direct influences on social norms, here's where we find a larger set of policies that draw on behavioral science in particular. Information, not just information, but social and behavior communications, knowledge and attitudes interventions, so interventions that will provide sufficient information to adjust beliefs, creating social networks to leverage normative change, and interventions on expectations and aspirations. So the most known paper on this is this paper in Saudi Arabia. So there are two. I'm going to refer to the less known one, but the most known one is one that got men in a room and asked them, do you think your wife should work? And found that men were a lot more progressive than when asked, how many of the men in this room do you think would agree with their wives to work? Which they thought they were more conservative. Once they adjusted the information, they told everybody, you know that you thought you're very much in agreement with your wife working, and most of the men in this room are the same in agreement. Based on this new information, would you agree with your wife enrolling in a job search program? That actually increased the take-up of their job search program for men, just by correcting information. This other one in Saudi Arabia with female university students received information about their peer aspirations. Basically, what do you think your other classmates want to do after finishing college? Do they want to get married? Do they want to start working? And it showed that their aspirations were a lot higher for labor market participation, and then basically corrected that perception. Then in terms of knowledge and attitudes for the future and expectation aspirations, there's this India intervention that rolled out a curriculum in schools for girls and boys to discuss gender equality and challenge prejudice, and got a stronger commitment by, boys in particular to update their beliefs and prejudices and to have more progressive attitudes, including boys reporting that they would allow their wives to work, they would support their sisters with their education, and they signed pledges to do this in the future. A similar intervention in India used edutainment, to reduce gender-based violence by providing a soap opera and episodes on Facebook called The Court of Sex, and then ask young men to sign up a pledge with UN Women and other institutions towards reducing gender-based violence. All to say, these different channels combined are the most likely to support social norms change. And the main entry points here, for example, to address this are of different kinds: circumvent or prevent the norm from happening, eliminating sanctions, myths, tackles, or creating a new norm. Since I know we're short on time, I'm going to give two examples. One on what in behavioral science we call choice architecture, that basically eliminates the sanctions myth, and this is on land titling. In Liberia, the government changed the forms for land titling, creating a second line that was mandatory for a second name, which is the wife's names, to be included in the land regularization for households to receive both extension services and improved seeds. This actually meant that men didn't have to debate whether it was good or bad for their reputation to put their wife's name on the land title. It was just what the government required. This actually increased women's access to land, which in result increases their ability to access all these other services to improve both productivity, but also give them more bargaining power. So there is a way to say, well, everybody's going to disagree, but this has been designed, and by this design, we cannot change things. We can prevent norms from happening or circumventing them, and this is the case, for example, of the women-only metro cards, with caveats. The women-only metro cards basically prevent the idea that women in the public space are prey for harassment with no sanctions to those that are doing it, and even for men to feel good about themselves. So India, Sao Paulo, and other countries have created women's only metro cards that basically prevent that from happening. However, in Brazil, because the intervention was solely on the metro cards, harassment started happening at the platform level. So it didn't really change the norm, it just deterred from it. And then creating a new norm, there is this really new and very interesting paper out of Sierra Leone on female genital cutting that did a combined set of interventions on community discussions and community discussions about creating a new norm to preserve girls from being cut, while at the same time preserving the family honor. Then again, this is from the community base. And a bunch of resources, I can share this in the chat. And I think that's about it. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much for that, Anna Maria, to give us a nice context and background regarding behavioral science, gender, and norms overall. So now on to our next speaker, over to Anna, to you.
Hi, everyone, and thank you so much, Ana Maria, for that great introduction on social norms. I'm going to share the work that we've been doing within UNDP in the Ecuador country office. And this is part of the work done by the Accelerator Lab. So let me just organize the visualizations and we're ready to go. Okay, so I want to share with you the work that we've been doing in terms of finding practical solutions for school gender-based violence. And the name of this initiative is called Brave Schools. So let's start talking about the problem. The problem, as Ana Maria mentioned already, is that gender violence exists. In the case of Ecuador, 6 out of 10 women have been victims of violence at some point in their lives. And let's go over the different forms of violence. So we're talking about physical, psychological, and sexual violence. And the repercussions that violence has in a person's life is deterministic. It's affecting their well-being, their physical being, their emotions, and their cognitive development. So facing this problem, the approach that we decided to take is to go through the power of education. Since education ensures that children and adolescents are protected from forms and from different forms of violence in their school lives. So we wanted to have an early intervention in the person's life, and we went to their school lives. And let's remember that education is an important socializing mechanism. So it allows us to transform behaviors as well as social norms. So now I want to share how we did this. So we worked with the education community, and we were doing two things with them. On one side, we were reflecting and changing perception about gender norms. And on the other side, we were bringing these into action and reinforcing those new actions. So the key element of this initiative is that we work with the entire education community. So we were working with students and teachers, among other authorities of the school, running this methodology that is called dialogue circles. I'm going to share with you what it is. So you select a reading. This reading has to be academic, has to talk about school gender violence. You meet once a week in a circle that is safe, non-hierarchical, that you can easily connect with your peers as well as with the reading. And third, you are asked to read and highlight a section of this reading that appeals to you. So by having this space just to have reflections among your peers, I will share with you what happened, but this was mainly the base of the methodology that we were applying. On the other side, bringing these, the reflections that we had were challenging gender stereotypes, gender norms. So we wanted to actually not just stay at the level of challenging stereotypes and gender norms, but trying to find different ways to change behavior and to bring this to action. So in that sense, we worked along with families, creating joint working groups that had families, students, and teachers, so that we can build a code of conduct in the school. And this code of conduct can actually reflect with new norms what we don't like anymore that happens in our school and doesn't make us feel good as girls or boys. The results that I'm going to share with you are sustained on the evaluation that we were running all along the intervention. So we run on the left side, we run an impact evaluation. Just to give you a very quick breakdown of what we did, we were measuring before and after the initiative. So we were running this econometric model that is called difference in difference. The main hypothesis besides this evaluation work is that you have to compare apples to apples. So in that sense, we guaranteed that we were using the group that attended the school in the morning as a control group, and the group that was attending the school in the afternoon as a treatment group. In terms, and I'm moving towards the right, in terms of how we collected this data, so we used a survey to have information in terms of their perception of diverse forms of violence, as I just showed you earlier, but also to collect information in terms of the socioeconomic situation of the household. And we collected even more information using mixed methods and running focus groups. So here are the key results. So we were asking before the initiatives to the participants, teachers, as well as students, how often they leave violence. And in that sense, we have different categories of violence and how often they leave them. So the main change that we saw is that before the intervention, participants will reply almost never. I never experienced violence throughout my life. And after the initiative, they moved to mostly more than once, or most of the time I am experiencing violence. So this means that actually the intervention and these conversations and reflections were achieving the results that we wanted to see. Here are a few quotes from the participants. I'm just going to focus on one of them. So this is what was said. I believe there has been a change. Now we understand that the violence we once saw as common is not and should not be. Talking and reflecting about have taught us that even minor things must be taken into account and resolved. And here are a few reflections. I'm just going to focus on two of them. So first of all, I want to emphasize that this might sound very simple to implement, because we are reading, we are discussing, we are reflecting among a group of peers. And in that sense, it's very simple and cost-effective, the initiative. But of course, it comes along with resistance and skepticism, especially from teachers. So the way that we overcame that was to give further detail about the methodology and previous evidence on how this methodology has already been used for gender violence. Another reflection I want to share with you is in terms of the evaluation, we want to have information that is non-biased. So of course, along the initiative, we had collaborators, those participants that were really eager with the purpose of the initiative on what we were doing. But also we found participants that were a bit more apathetic and really didn't care what was happening. So in that sense, we collect data from both groups and as well in the focus group to have a sense of what could have been targeting better those apathetic participants. So if you want to know more about this initiative, all the documentation is uploaded on our webpage. This is where you can find it. And without further ado, I just want to thank for the space.
Thank you so much, Anna, for that really interesting, insightful case study example. We'll dive into some more questions shortly. So on that point, we have some questions coming in the Q&A box, lots of different ones, from general ones to specific ones. So feel free to put them in there and we'll discuss after. There are also a number of resources that have been shared in the chat by Dana. So check those out as well. And if you want to know more, we can also do that too. Okay, so with that, on to our final speaker for today, Magda, over to you.
Thank you very much, Mary. And thank you to the previous speakers. I'm very much enjoying the conversation so far. So I'm just going to share my screen. So my name is Magdalena Howland, and I work at the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime. And I specifically work in the Gender and Human Rights Project of the Global Programme on Implementing the Organised Crime Convention. And today I would like to give a brief presentation on how we can utilize behavioral science to advance gender mainstreaming in organized crime policies. And so I'd like to start this off by introducing how social norms and organized crime are linked. So as highlighted in the first presentation, social norms are informal and unwritten rules within a space. And so when we're looking at organized criminal groups, we can understand them as a socialization space. So within these spaces, in the organized crime space, there's acceptable and appropriate behavior that guides the organized criminal group. And this behavior can be understood through the lens of masculinities, because what you will often see is that organized criminal groups often have very hyper-masculine behavior. And so if you conform to the masculine behavior, you are accepted within the group. And this is, for example, you can see this through initiation rights within organized criminal groups, where members or potential members of an organized criminal group need to prove themselves as men. And they need to prove that they're willing to conform to this hyper-masculine behavior. So, for example, in some organized criminal groups, the initiation rights will be through violence and sexual behavior with women. And then what you will then see is the more masculine a man within an organized criminal group is, the more likely they are to go up the ranks of an organized criminal group. And this can be seen as a social reward. So the more masculine you are, the more social capital you have. And so whereas if you don't conform to this behavior, it can potentially lead to exclusion from this group. But when we talk about social norms within organized criminal groups, it is also really important to recognize that these social norms are context specific and they can change from organized criminal group to organized criminal group, within countries, within cities. And so for this reason, I'd like to draw on a case study from Trinidad and Tobago that looks at the link between masculinities and organized crime. So at UNODC, in the Global Programme on Implementing the Organised Crime Convention, we do not actually collect this data firsthand. And so to fill this gap, we tend to draw on academic papers. And the one that I'll be drawing on today is called Breaking Bad, Gangs, Masculinities and Murder in Trinidad. And it was written by Adam Baird, who is an academic who we often collaborate with in our work. And so this paper looks at how masculinities and social terrains looks at masculinities, social terrains and organized criminal groups within Trinidad and Tobago, and specifically in a place called Laventille in the port of Spain. And so just to set the context, Laventille is an area in the port of Spain with very high rates of violence and social exclusion. It is an area where there's high rates of criminalization and as a result, very oppressive law enforcement. But we should also look at the history of this place. This is a community that originates from emancipated slaves who relocated to this area to escape racism and inequality. And so as a result, this is an area where there's large mistrust in the state and in the criminal justice system. And there's also high rates of violence as a form of rebellion to the state. And as a result, this is a space where organized criminal groups are able to thrive because they capitalize on the social exclusion experienced by men. So they feel that they are not manly enough within the society. And as a result, they also capitalize on increased levels of violence. And based on this, they utilize gender norms to showcase what it means to be a good man or a good woman within this space of social exclusion. And so when we look at this context of social exclusion, it is evident that the organized criminal group is able to come in and to create a social terrain where social and gender norms are developing. And so, like I mentioned previously, these norms can be understood through the concepts of masculinities and femininities. So masculinities is what behaviors associated with being a man, and then femininities of behaviors associated with being a woman. So if we look at the women who are associated with these organized criminal groups, they are predominantly expected to stay indoors, and they are showcasing behavior associated with emphasized femininities. And these behaviors align with several concepts, and that is respectability. So they uphold the respectability within this given area. They represent motherhood and they represent marriage. Whereas when we are looking at the men within this community, and specifically within this organized criminal space, their masculine traits are seen as social capital, as advancing themselves within this context. And so this behavior is hypermasculine and is associated with many sexual partners, violence, strength, being the breadwinner, so tapping into that expectations of what it means to be a man, but also power. And so as a result, when you look at this organized criminal group, you will see that the more one conforms to this behavior of these gendered norms and this hypermasculinity, the more acceptance there is within the community and within this space of historical social exclusion. But it's important also to mention that this behavior is accepted throughout the community that with which the organized criminal group operates in. And that is because of the dynamic from the what is perceived as a masculine capital, so the capital being accepted within this space, and the history of social exclusion. And so the question that you may have is, how is this actually relevant to policies against organized crime? So at UNODC, within the global program on implementing the Organized Crime Convention, we support policymakers in the development of gender and human rights sensitive policies and legislation against organized crime. And we do this with the recognition that policies that respond to the diverse experiences of all people result in more nuanced and effective responses to the complex and evolving landscape of organized crime. And this is where I believe behavioral science is an extremely important tool, because it can help us understand the behaviors within an organized criminal group and within a specific context. And as a result, we can tailor policies to address it. And the way that we get policymakers and legislators to reflect on these on the social norms within this context is predominantly through our technical assistance work, but also within the toolkit we recently published on gender and human rights mainstreaming and implementation of the Organized Crime Convention. And here I'd like to draw on two examples of the methodology that we use with our national stakeholders in our workshops to disseminate this toolkit that I mentioned. And so first of all, we do an exercise where we ask national stakeholders to map a wheel of privilege and power. And essentially what the wheel of privilege and power is, it helps us identify what social categories within society and within a given context can affect one's power and privilege. And the reason that we do this within this workshop is because there is, again, that recognition that social norms and gender norms are context specific. So when we're working with stakeholders, it's really important that we're able to at least have some sense of understanding of what that context is. And once we've mapped this context, we then carry out an exercise called the power walk, which I'm sure quite a few of you will be familiar with. And within this exercise, we give participants fictional identities, and we ask them to step either forward or backwards, depending on the prompts that we give them. And so the further ahead a person is, depending on the prompt, the more vulnerable they are to their vulnerability to organized crime reduces. And so within this exercise, we use perception-based questions. So we encourage those standing in the room to reflect on why they have certain reflections and opinions on why they're standing or stepping forward or backwards. And so this then helps the national stakeholders to reflect on what the social norms are within the context in which they're working. And so with that, I hope that gives a short introduction on how gender and social norms can help us understand organized crime better, but also how we can support policymakers and legislators to develop more effective approaches against organized crime. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you for those remarks, Magda, and looking forward to having a conversation, diving a bit deeper into that. I see some questions. I think this whole area of work, organized crime, seems quite new to some of the people in the audience today, so we can explore those. So everyone, turn your cameras on. We're going to answer a few questions, so as mentioned, and Dana too, and Anna Maria, please come in. I see some questions were answered already. We might revisit some of them because I think they do touch upon the bigger themes. Donna, would you like to join us with your camera, or you don't need to if you don't want to, but you're welcome to join this conversation. Great. Oh, maybe, yeah, there we go. Okay.
Sorry,
so,
I was answering some questions.
yeah, there's a lot coming in. All good. You can do what you like. You don't need to, you can either write or join us here. Okay, so a few, maybe we'll start with a few questions, Anna Maria. You answered a few already in the chat, thinking about, and there are resources to a lot of the work at the World Bank has done and more broadly. So there's a question about the magic wand and which gender norms would you work on if you could change any norm, and you answered that a little bit there, but that needs to explore a little bit further. And then there's also a question here about where is it? I think you may have answered. You've answered them already, Donna. You've gone ahead of me. Anna Maria, would you like to comment some of the questions you've answered already, or Donna as well? I can pull some of them out, but there are quite a few. There are ones you think that are most insightful. I think one of them that might be interesting is how is this different from social norms work that's been going on for many years? How are we adding a behavioral science element to this? So I think that's a good one, but feel free to answer any of them or expand upon your responses as well. Go over to you.
I'm going to try to answer 3 of them. Let's see if I can make this happen. So, and I'm going to start with how do you measure? Because we started a measurement. So we tend to, and this is what I said at the beginning, we tend to look at the outcome. We tend to see, are girls going to school? Or what's the prevalence of gender-based violence? So when we only look at the outcome, we are not looking at the process of changing a norm. So what we're trying to argue is that you need to look at these variations of things, right? So you need to measure whether you are, I call this the norm elasticity. So if you think of it, how much are you breaking at the boundaries of the norm? So how many more people may be doing things differently? How lower the sanction level is. If at the beginning your household is fully scorned, and then basically, yeah, there is some gossip, but it's not that bad. Does your husband lose his job or lose his standing in the community if you go work, versus he gets some comments, but it's okay. He still plays cards with his friends. So understanding how the norm is softening is actually one of the intermediate steps that we get to observe before we observe the full transformation. So that's one on how do you measure if this is working. That is one, right? And it's basically going back to the same questions that you ask. And we have this example, and I think it's there's now in all of our work on female labor force participation, when we've asked people, not only is it okay for women to work, but is it okay for women to work if they have small children? Is it okay for women to work if they have to leave their children with someone else? Is it okay if they work in mixed gender spaces? And if they work in mixed gender spaces and come back after 5? And you realize that there is like a curve here where don't come back after 5. That for sure. But work from home, work part-time. So then you see that the norms start softening. So that is one, which takes me to Winnie's question, which is a question that we get asked a lot. Are we imposing external social norms? So this relates to what's behavioral science useful for in these settings. For the most part, we treat social norms as this grandiose explanation that it is there and it explains anything that is not explained by development, finance, education, or other forces that we can clearly pinpoint. So the residual bucket is always, oh, but that's social norms. And social norms are culture, and culture cannot be touched. But when we start picking at the behavior that we want to see differently, which is a behavioral science diagnostic, where we basically go and say, okay, what are the determinants of this behavior? What are the motivations, the opportunities, and the systems? Then when we encounter the social norm, we're going to encounter a very specific application of the norm, not the entirety of culture. We're just going to find that there is this norm, which is this perceived sanctioned collective behavior about this specific thing that people do that has all these other determinants that we can then address with a behavioral science intervention. So we can correct a misperception. We're not looking to change a country. We're looking to change a specific behavior and make it easier to take place. So for the most part, through these processes, and we've done this with client countries, this is our own developed setting. And I'm going to give one example that is a bank team working in Sub-Saharan Africa as the SWEAT project. And I mean, in Nigeria for Women has also done the same. SWEAT is working in a collective of countries in the Sahel, and they decided to engage religious leaders to discuss particularly these prescriptions. They brought them together, including the Grand Imam and the scholars of religion, to discuss these issues. Like, okay, do our books, do our traditions tell us that women cannot go outside and work? And they came up jointly with a statement that said, actually not. Under these parameters, we are completely okay with this happening. They wrote a statement and they sent it back to all the religious village leaders where we were working on, so they could be spreading the word about this and changing a little bit the beliefs. So the more this is self-born, and I think this is the example that I was giving on Sierra Leone, you need people to decide to embrace a new norm and to abandon a poor equilibrium. And behavioral science tools help with that because we help breaking down things. We can help with a system intervention. So say, for example, a choice architecture intervention. And what is different is that then our type of interventions, even our standard social behavior change communications, change, because we're not telling you, you know, that in X country or in the city, things happen this way. We're telling you about how can you slowly and small things make differences. Whether it is by separating cash. So if there is a cash transfer, we give a 10% for women that can use for their households. So there's no norm on women holding the money and others. So all these tools can be used. Sorry, that was a bit longer, but.
No, great. Thank you, Ana Maria. There's a lot there to unpack. And again, there are lots of resources in the chat too, if you want to know more about that, because there's clearly been a lot of work on the World Bank on this topic. So we'll dive into those. But thank you for those comments. So now over to a few for Ana. So I know you've answered a couple, but there's There's one here about, the methods that you spoke to. Can these be used to tackle other things like reducing bullying and other aspects in schools? To what extent do you think this approach would work in other areas? And then there were also some questions that you answered, but I think they're good ones that I have a feeling others on the call might be interested in as well. But who did you partner with to run this project? What kind of partners did you have? And then also children are also not just at school. They also have their families, they have their community and social settings. How do you bring that into your conversation, to the thinking that you have, and how do you measure long-term impact when they're perhaps confounding other things happening outside of the schools, which is where you have control? So I'll leave you those 3 questions, and then there are some more if we have time.
Thank you, Mary. And just to point out that these methodologies have a Creative Commons license, so actually can be used by anyone within the audience. I invite you to review the work that we've done, but as I mentioned, we're not the first ones implementing this methodology of dialogical circles. So feel free to just go ahead and try this out, because there is a lot of material of do-it-yourself, how to implement this in different contexts as well. This methodology, as I mentioned, it is quite straightforward. It's reading, reflecting, coming together. Of course, it has an important key element in terms of facilitating the session, because the main purpose of talking about these norms or defying gender stereotypes is that we feel respected by who is in the room, and that we can also share our voices, because sometimes our voices might not be the mainstream of the room, or to think differently than those who are there. So just to point that out, and also to mention that this methodology has not only been used within schools, you can actually use it in non-formal education contexts. So for instance, if they have been used in shelters, in migration camps, they have been also used in prison. So in that sense, don't feel that the limitation is that they have to be used within the school context. So for instance, the work that we're currently starting to do is to pass this methodology along so that it can be used within children shelters. Those children are escaping from domestic violence, but we also want to work with their families so that they find other ways of communicating that is not violence. Because what we have found as well is that when you ask them why you use violence to make your point, to give a message, to interact, most of the time the response relies on that's one of the ways that I know, and that's also what I have experienced in my life. So it doesn't necessarily come out of I am proud of this, but this is the immediate mechanism that I have to resolve problems. So this means that through conversations and giving that person the support that they need to go throughout this process, those behaviors can be changed. So that in terms of the first question, like, can this be used for bullying? Of course, it can be used for that, and not only for that, because you select the readings based on the topic that you want to target. So we target the topic of school gender-based violence. You can target the topic of bullying. With this case that I was mentioning, we are targeting the topic of domestic violence. So it really depends on what is the main purpose of the initiative that you select the readings, but the methodology still stays the same. Moving to the second question in terms of the team. So as I mentioned, we were running along of this intervention and impact evaluation. So for that, we recruited a few economists. I am an economist myself, so that we can have the know-how in terms of how to apply these methods in terms of econometric models, how to collect data. To apply the methodology itself, you need educators, you need people that actually have a background on psychology and work with groups, because you're facilitating a conversation on topics that are not necessarily easy to talk about, and takes sometimes to build that trust in the person that is facilitating the session. It doesn't happen immediately neither. And the last question in terms of who else was in the team, well, actually, I reached out at some point to Ana Maria from the World Bank when we were starting this, and exchanging ideas, asking her, this is what we were thinking, what do you think about this? She said it makes sense, like keep me in the loop in case you need like any further feedback. So in that sense, like we were using the knowledge that UNDP has, but of course, reaching out to the network and especially to experts that have been doing this for very long, like Ana Maria. And the last question was, I forgot the last question, Mary, if you could remind me.
Apologies. The last question was, if I remember either. Did you partner? I don't remember. I'll come back to it. Maybe we'll come back to it. I'll ask you again, Anna. But maybe over to Magda now for a few questions for her. So there's one question more generally about the methods you use within organized crime. I think it's a new space, as I said, for a number of people on the call. But then also there's a question, have you encountered ambiguity of men in belonging to gangs in which they're on one hand, they use this form of violence against women, but on the other with their mothers and kind of different kind of feelings towards women in different parts of their lives. So how do you address that more generally in the thinking that you do? But I'll come back to you, Anna, on your question. There's a lot here to navigate through, but Magda, over to you for now.
Thank you very much. So I'll first start off with the question on methods on masculinities and organized crime. And this is where I'd like to highlight that in 2021, we published an issue paper on organized crime and gender issues relating to the United Nations Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime. And this issue paper basically gives an in-depth overview on how gender is related to organized crime. And we informed this issue paper through engaging with a wide range of academics in the field, including many academics who specialize in masculinities and organized crime, who are able to bring forward the evidence that there is and that first-hand experience of engaging with men who operate within that organized crime space. And so this has been really useful to increase the knowledge that we have in this area, but also for us to be able to develop more effective approaches against organized crime as a result. But I'd also like to highlight that we're currently disseminating the Gender and Human Rights Toolkit, like I mentioned earlier. And when we disseminate this toolkit, we take a multi-stakeholder approach. And what that means is that we do not only engage with national authorities, but we also engage with civil society, academia, and other international organizations, and have a space where we can discuss best practices in combating organized crime. And quite often when we have these workshops, we invite civil society organizations who specialize in working with men who were previous offenders of organized crime. And a nice example of this is when we were in Colombia, there was a specific organization that looked at utilizing positive masculinities as a preventative measure against organized crime. So although there is no specific methodology that we have to look at masculinities and organized crime, essentially we try to engage with as many stakeholders as possible to really get that evidence base and to see how it can be applied in policies and legislation. And then on the question of whether men in these spaces can also, whether these gender norms can change when they go home, yes. So essentially what we have seen in the organized criminal space is, like I mentioned, the organized criminal group is basically a socialization space. So there's certain behavior that is seen as appropriate behavior within the organized criminal group. But then what evidence is found is that these men can then go home and they can be caring fathers, they can be caring brothers, and they can be caring sons. So yes, there are of course cases of gender-based violence, but it doesn't mean that they always carry that violent behavior home. And this is actually an extremely useful tool in preventative measures against organized crime, because you can utilize the family dynamic to actually either to prevent organized crime from happening or to encourage men to step out of the organized criminal space. And I think a very cool example of this is a case study that looks at she's known as the matriarch of the Gaia cartel in Honduras, and it looks at Digna Vaya, who is essentially this leader of this organized criminal group. And what you saw is that, so long story short, she went to the US and she got arrested. But because she had this mother role within her community and within this organized criminal group space, they actually convinced her to convince her brother and her sons to hand themselves in, because she was able to draw on the strength of being the mother within that space. And I think this is a really nice example of how these different spaces can also be utilized to prevent organized crime from happening, or to identify organized crime in the first place. Thank you.
Great, thank you for that, Magda. And for a lot of these examples, it really underscores the oftentimes complexity in the situations we're looking at, and it's not maybe so straightforward as just a social norm, right? We've just unpacked a lot of different things about them. Okay, so I have 1 minute left, but I do recall a question for you, Anna. It was, so how much, although students are in school, and that's where you're able to have your intervention, they also go home to their communities and their families. So how have you incorporated that into your thinking, especially in the long-term thinking of what you're doing? Over to you.
I'm going to be very brief because I know that we're over time, but as I mentioned, the initiative focused on the education community. So from the start, we were not aiming to work just with students or teachers or authorities, but rather every actor that plays a key role within the school life. And that's also families, of course. Of course, once the students are out of the school, you have no longer an easy connection with families, or you cannot really know what's happening in the household. But as long as the students are within the school, you can easily provoke these conversations with families. So that's what we relied on, and actually we included them as a key actor in this change. As I mentioned, we were like the dialogue circles were taking place, but at the same time, we were building this code of conduct based on these new reflections that we were having, so that we can put our words into actions. And to build that code of conduct, we worked along with families. They were one of the main key actors. So just to briefly respond to the question, that's how we included them in the process.
Right. Okay. Well, thank you for that, for clarifying that point. Okay, so I think we've reached time. We're actually a minute over. So thank you so much for our panelists for joining us today. There's still more questions there, lots of resources as well. So note those down the last 30 seconds we have here. So thank you very much to our panelists. We'll have this recording available on our YouTube playlist over the next day or so. And again, Behavioral Science Week is still continuing for the next few days, so lots more to check out in the future too. So thank you, panelists, and thank you to the audience for joining us, and looking forward to seeing you soon.
Thank you, Mary.
Okay, thanks everyone.
Thank you.
Bye for now.